This is Brenda Zeman, and I'm speaking to Al Lafayette. Okay, Al, can you tell me, first of all, a little bit about growing up in Rosetown?
That should be most interesting. Growing up in Rosetown, Rosetown is a very small community, around 2,000 people in the community.
And you were born in 1953.
I was born in 1953 in Rosetown, and my father wasn't quite sure what he wanted to do for a living. So he spent his time in my early years working for the pipeline as it went through Western Canada.
And your father is Lewis.
My father is Lewis, right. And so for the first 2 years of my life, which I don't remember, we spent a lot of time moving all across Saskatchewan and Alberta. And then my father decided that he wanted to farm. And he took over my grandfather's land.
And your grandfather's Carl.
My grandfather's Carl. And that's about my earliest recollections, living out on the original site that my grandfather had, which was quite close to my great-grandfather's farm site. And during that time period, I didn't even know that there were people of different colors. I think possibly I might have started to realize that going to Sunday school and singing the song Jesus Loves Little Children, red, yellow, black, and white. But there was never any consciousness that we were any different than anybody else until about the time I started school. And then it was basically all of a sudden realizing that my cousins and our hair did not blow in the wind. When people ran their fingers through their hair, the males in particularly were not running their fingers through their hair. I really can't remember. I don't know when it really dawned on me that I was different. As I said earlier to you, we had no contact with black people at all during my early years, except for relatives.
Now, about your relatives, you said you had a number of cousins. How many were in the district?
In my family, my parents had 3 children, including myself. And then right next to us, my Uncle Earl and his wife Jean, they had 7 children. And then directly across the road from them, my Uncle Homer and his wife Evelyn also had 7 children. So there were 17 of us in total.
17 in a small town.
Well, out in the country, we were between Herschel and Fisk.
What impact do you think all you children had when you finally did start going to school and becoming really noticeable in school competitions and those sorts of things?
Okay, the school that we went to was a community of Fisk, which was 7.5 miles south of where we lived. And it was basically a German Mennonite community. And as we grew in numbers, one child to growing in numbers at school, people began to accept us more so. However, in things like track and field, when we would combine with 2 other communities, I would say up until about the time that I was 8 or 9, we would hear parents coaching their children, "You've got to beat those niggers, you've got to beat them." We'd be running down the racetracks, and you would hear the parents, "Come on, beat that nigger," which was quite interesting, so it made us more determined than ever. I, in particular, I did not live up to the family standards for track and field until about the time I was about 11 or 12.
And what were the family standards?
Number 1 all the time. There was a little presentation with a crest. If you were the champion of your age group, you got a crest. And every Lafayette got a crest except for me, if I recall, until I was about 11 years old and started to grow, so I had the physical advantage over the rest. But the rest of my cousins were very, very good in track and field, and uncles and aunts.
What would you do when you heard these things? Would you go home, and did you ever ask your parents what all this was about?
No, at least I didn't. We would get together after an event and get in a little huddle and say, "Did you see what that lady said?" And we'd point and start figuring out, and it would make us more determined that we were going to beat them. We had been taught as children that we were not supposed to say these things, that they had racial overtones, etc. So we never really were allowed to come back with names and things like that. Going to school in Fisk was interesting for my older cousins. There have been stories that, particularly with the eldest one, that he went to school and being the first black child in the community.
What's his name?
Donald. That he was tied to a tree, and they would play cowboys and Indians, and he was always the Indian, and they'd tie him up to the tree during the recess time. And teachers never really put a stop to this. Teachers really didn't know how to combat what was going on the playgrounds.
Now, he wasn't the first black child. Your grandfather and...
But he was the first black child to go to school in Fisk.
Okay.
The rest of my relatives had gone to school in a country school called Oskaloosa.
Now, Oskaloosa was the Lafayettes really kind of dominated that school.
Yes, to a certain extent. The Lafayettes have always felt that education was very, very important. And my great uncles, in fact, had gone to university here. A few of them had gone to university here in Saskatoon, and education was something that was very important to them, and having a school that close to them made it possible for them to go to school.
And Oskaloosa was named after the area that your family came from in Iowa.
Right, right. My great-grandfather's family, right.
So after the country school, then Fisk was the first
after
real
that school
town
closed
school.
down, right. And so we had quite a few problems in the early years. I started school in 1959, and name-calling was still something that would happen. I don't really think that it had that much of racial overtones perhaps at that time, as opposed to just being different. If you were overweight or underweight or whatever, you were called something, and because we were noticeably different, we would be called things. So I don't think that it was really that intentional. And even to the thing that I referred to earlier, where they were tying my cousin up to a tree, I don't think that I think it was done out of being naive.
Mm-hmm. I'm interested in what the consciousness of your family was in terms of being black.
It was never really mentioned. Some of my earliest recollections are turning on the television and watching programs where Ethel Waters would play a maid, and it would be Yes Ma'am, this kind of stuff. Very, very dumb stereotypes which we've seen in all the movies made, particularly up until the 60s. And those kind of movies were a great source of embarrassment. And never did our family relate, when I say our family, children, we never did relate to those kind of people. We would sort of hang our heads in shame if a group of us were watching a movie or something.
So had you ever met any American blacks?
To the best of my knowledge, I had not met any American blacks at all. No. The only people I saw were relatives on both sides of my family. My mother is also black.
Now, can you tell me a little bit about your mother, her maiden name, and where she was from?
Her name was Hazel Saunders, and she was from Amber Valley, which was a black community in northern Alberta, north of Edmonton and Athabasca.
A very famous one.
Yeah, a very famous community. The people up there were relatively poor farmers at that time. They had very, very small farms. And she went to a school that had a sizable black population also, and there was a mixture of quite a few Ukrainian people too.
Okay, since your mother and your father were both black, what sorts of stories did they tell you about black history in terms of your own family?
To the best of my knowledge, my father never ever said anything at all. On my mother's side of the family, my mother had experienced quite a bit of racism as a child growing up in Amber Valley. And at times she could be quite bitter about some of her childhood experiences.
Can you remember anything in particular?
Not specifics, just general overhaul things, name-calling, teachers being quite naive and treating the black children in a different way, sometimes ridiculing them in front of the rest of the class, and things like that.
Do you think your mother had a different attitude towards others than your father?
My mother's attitude was basically towards our immediate family: go out and get an education and fight. You are every bit as good as anybody else, because she had experienced the idea that being black you were inferior. So that was basically a push from her: go out and do whatever it is that you want to do and become whatever you want. Whereas on the Lafayette side of the family, there was that push for success a personal success, but never because of racial overtones. There very, very rarely was our color mentioned.
Do you think your mother was proud to be black?
Um, that I cannot answer. I don't think. No, I don't think she was proud to be black. No, I don't think so.
I'm wondering what impact the 60s had on people like your mother and father. The growing consciousness of blacks in the United States, for example.
Watching the Dr. Martin Luther King and that period with the peace marches and the riots with Malcolm X and all of the things down there, I think that was when we all, as teenagers or preteens, started to realize that we were black. I think that became a time when we really started to realize it, because for the first time, black people were in the news and on television, and people were starting to interview them, and they had feelings, and they weren't playing the stereotype roles that we suggested before. So I think then we started realizing, that was when I myself started going to the library and checking out books and reading. Hey, I am black, I am different, and what is my history, you know?
How old were you when you started being really curious?
I would say 11 or 12 years old. That was when I went through a period of time where I really loved music. I have quite a sizable record collection, and all of a sudden it was black artists only. And
Motown?
Motown, definitely Motown. I would say that Ed Sullivan and shows at that time had a great impact upon all of us.
All right, you're bringing home your Motown records. What are the other kids in Fisk saying?
Actually, I had no friends in Fisk or as such that came to the house, so
who did you have? Your cousins and your
basically our cousins.
Did you turn them on to Motown sound?
We had quite a contrast there, because one family across the road, Uncle Homer and Auntie Evelyn's children. Auntie Evelyn was white, eh? So her children, they also came from a Christian background, and they seemed to be quite liberal as to, because of their heritage. They did not think of things as in black and white during this time period. And I think that the rest of us started realizing, because of our physical appearance, that we wanted to know what was going on, and probably stressed a little more blackness in our records and things like that. Watching Ed Sullivan was I think one of my greatest personal things to turn me on to wanting to find out more about being black, because all of a sudden Diana Ross and the Supremes would walk out, and the audience would go, wow, and number one, you know, they had so many number one hit records. The Temptations, Gladys Knight and the Pips, we'd see them all.
You started looking at yourself in a different light.
Yes, and I would say that had a great influence on my female cousins too, because of all the hairstyles and the fashions and stuff that you saw, because prior to that...
Had they been straightening their hair and trying to be white?
Yes, our mothers straightened their hair, and the daughters were straightening their hair. But I guess the Motown people basically had straight hair up until the later years, and so they had new ideas, creativity and stuff, colors, a sense of style, fashion, which we really didn't see before,
Now, as you were getting into your blackness, what were your parents saying? What was their reaction?
I think silence, if I remember correctly, silence, because it wasn't something that we really pushed. We sort of did it secretly. You know, I had made up my mind that I was only going to buy black music. I had made up my mind that when I went to the library and checked out books, that they were going to be by black authors, such as Richard Wright and etc. And I think it was something that I did on my own. I would put them out on the table, and my mother was an avid reader, and she would start reading them too, and occasionally my mother and I would have discussions about the black situation, and that was when I would find out things of her childhood. Unfortunately, I don't recall all of the things, but
a sense of what she felt still remains with you.
I know that we were quite distressed as a family when Martin Luther King was assassinated, and we watched the situation. We were always quite aware of which American presidents seemed to be pro-black in their feelings or in a lot of the laws that they were passing.
Did your parents ever say what life would have been like had you stayed in the States?
No, that was never really discussed. Basically, the idea was that we should be quite happy where we were, and being in a religious home, God knew best, and this is where we were, and life in the past was never really discussed.
It started from when you came to Saskatchewan.
Basically, yes, basically. Basically, I have regrets, like my grandmother Jamerson was well into her 90s when she died.
So that's how you're married to Frida how you're related to Frida Ellis.
And I really regret that I hadn't been aware enough to ask questions. I really regret that I really don't know that much about my history. You probably know more than I do, having talked to a lot of them. But I have regrets like that. Watching Roots, the TV show, of course, there's a family that knows supposedly everything. And it's sort of sad to, sitting in class, I can remember in grade 8 when we started talking about our past. And kids would stand up and say, well, our family lived here for X number of years, and then we were in the United States, and then we moved over from Germany or Russia or England or whatever. And it was kind of sad because the teachers would then turn to us and what is your background? And you'd sort of hang your head in a way when we came over from the United States. And occasionally, were you slaves? And it was quite upsetting. Another thing that just came to mind that I found humiliating, personally, in the school system was in grade 6 when we were studying about the American states and the history of slavery. I found that very, very unsettling because it was the first time that I felt that the class was drawn to look at us, take a look at all of the Lafayettes in the classroom. And
they probably expected some sort of comment from you.
Yes, in a way, and we had no comment because at that time we'd never even really thought about it. All of a sudden, there we were presented in 3 or 4 paragraphs that was our background.
And that was it, in terms of black history, slavery.
Yeah, and 3 or 4 paragraphs. It was very brief.
Very brief. You must have wondered, there must have been more, you must have thought.
I think during that time period, I can almost say that I was ashamed during that time period. I think that I was ashamed to have been black because we came over here supposedly in chains and scraped out a living and escaped to Canada. And I think at that time I felt almost ashamed and was quite glad that it wasn't discussed. And then the next time I can remember in the classroom where we were really discussed as an ethnic group was in grade 9. And we were talking about the 4 groups of people on Earth, and Caucasians, etc. And when they discussed the Negroids, the teacher pointed to me and said that I was an example. Look at the broad nose, the thick lips, etc. And I was just mortified. And I can remember walking out, stopping up, and being quite angry.
What did you do anything?
Just anger, because. What could I do? I was really quite humiliated and yet sort of confused because after all I was a Negroid, and if this was the example which everybody could have seen,
the epitome in Fisk, I guess.
No, this was in Rosetown later on in high school.
Okay.
But that was something that I was quite upset about. But anyway.
After you moved from Fisk to Rosetown, you're moving to
slightly... No, we never... Oh, that was just for education.
In terms of school. The bigger places you went, did you find as it got bigger that people were a little more liberal or a little more knowledgeable?
Okay, well here again we went to a high school of about 400 children, and except for the children from Fisk and Darcy, which was a school that we had later joined with, they had no association with black people either. So I come trucking into school, and immediately I was probably about 2 inches taller than the average grade 9 student. Well, you would be great at basketball. Just immediately. I had never played basketball in my life because we did not have basketball courts in Fisk, and so there were assumptions like that. We were expected immediately that you would be great dancers and that in the choir you would immediately be able to sing, Even in church, we did have one minister and his wife that assumed because my parents would be black that they'd be great soloists. And my father unfortunately is not a singer. My mother was a singer, but she would never sing publicly. But they just stereotypes like that people expect.
Now, what church was that?
We went to the Pentecostal church in Rosetown.
The only black family, of course.
Yes, we were the only black family because the one family out there were not religious, and the other family went to yet another church. So yes, we were the only black family.
Okay, I'm interested in what happened when you started getting interested in girls and with dating.
Personally, for me, that was not a problem because I did not start dating until I went to college. The two girls that I took out in high school, one occasion only, each time, there was no problem at all. My brother started dating much, much younger, as soon as he was 16, and there were a lot of parents seemed to be quite upset. But we had a party line on the telephone, so if you were snooping, you could listen in and hear things. And when
what were you hearing?
When older cousins, were taking out the white girls, if you want to call them that, you would hear comments on the telephone.
Like, what would you hear?
Well, basically, did you know that so-and-so is taking out so-and-so? Oh, and because it was a party line, they knew that perhaps we were listening, but you could tell by the voices that people were not impressed. And in one situation, the woman said that the mother had decided that she was young and she'd keep her mouth shut and she'd grow out of it, and that if they opened up their mouths, this would be more determination for the relationship to continue on. For the girls, it was a lot harder because quite often people thought of them as definitely second-class citizens, and parents did not want their sons taking the daughters out.
Even more so than the boys?
I think more so than the boys, possibly because there were more girls. There were more girls out there, and they seemed to have more problems.
So how did the girls meet boys?
How
did they...
I would say that the average Lafayette girl was very good looking, and there was always somebody who had enough nerve to ask her out or didn't care. The consciousness, people were starting to accept as the show Julia was on television, and Diane Carroll was very beautiful, always lavishly dressed, etc. And I think people were starting to look at us as, okay, Bill Cosby's comedy show was on. This was about the time that the blacks were put on TV, probably more so than even now, in favorable lights. And there were always people that were more broad-minded or more understandable and would seem to overlook these kind of things.
Okay, what sort of contact did you have with other blacks in Saskatchewan? For example, did you have any contact with the Maidstone, people from the Maidstone
Only
settlement?
only relatives. It was after I left home that the Maidstone community had a big homecoming or something of that nature, and my great-uncle Homer and his wife Ellen went up to that. But basically, they, except for the Ellises, we had no relatives up there. And I myself did not know the community existed until I read the book Blacks in Canada. And
what year was that when you discovered that? Well, after 70, because that's when the book was written.
I read that book in grade 10 or 11. I think I read it the year it came out.
Now, how did you feel? You're talking about Robin Wink's prolific book,
Mm-hmm.
Blacks in Canada, which I think is really excellently researched. How did you feel when you read, hey, I've got a history?
Okay, this was what prompted me to read the book, because obviously Canadian blacks were different than American blacks. We did not have that culture with all of the jive talk, etc., that seemed to be portrayed on television. So obviously I felt that we were different, and because my parents never really said that much in the home, I wanted to know what was going on. So I ordered the book in. I had especially ordered in through the provincial library system, and
it wasn't exactly in hot demand in Saskatchewan.
No. I can remember the woman at the library really looked when I got it, and I concentrated a lot on Nova Scotia, as you probably know, and the East, but
Africville and.
Mm-hmm. I was really quite interested and impressed because all of a sudden, hey, there were people here in Canada. We weren't the only ones. The portion on Saskatchewan was rather scant. I kept looking for our name.
They missed you somehow.
Yes, they missed us somehow.
I can't imagine how.
And so I was disappointed in that, and I sort of felt, well, if we were missed, there must have been a lot of other people that were missed. So there are a lot of us out here, and I had purposely made up my mind that when I left home, I was going to seek out black people, which a lot of my cousins have done that have left the farm. They've moved to Edmonton, where there is a sizable black community. And their contact right away is relatives, and then they start meeting more and more blacks.
Can you remember, did you share this bit of newfound information with your cousins?
No. That was at a time period when most of my cousins were dating and were really into that kind of, just growing up, the average thing that you grow up into. And I was not really socially at that stage of my life, so I spent a lot of time reading and was at home. And so these kind of things, I was just storing my own information. My mother read the book, and we would discuss things.
What did your mother think of it?
I think she was in quite a bit of awe that all of this material had been researched.
The man took 10 years of his life to do that book.
Yeah, it was a fantastic book for research like that. I think she was quite sort of in awe because, as I say, we had no contact with black people at all.
Do you feel that the Lafayettes really lived in isolation in many ways?
I think that basically what, and I could be wrong, this is my assumption, but I think basically what they wanted to do was settle out in the Herschel-Fiske area and assimilate, become part of the community, get involved in the school boards, into church, into the Legion, all of the little social activities, and just be an ordinary person. They did not want to preserve blackness as such. We were no better, no worse. We were just part of the community.
You raise a really interesting point because in his book, in Robin Wink's book, he said that blacks left the United States because they couldn't be assimilated. They wanted to come to Canada to be assimilated. When they came to Canada, they came to a country where one's heritage was something to be prized, where people did not want to be assimilated. So it was like a paradox.
Yeah, it was difficult when you would watch situations where there were different ethnic days, like during 1967 when ethnic pride sort of came up during the centennial year, and you had all of your groups doing their folk dances and all this. We had nothing, which is something that I sort of regret even now, that we have no heritage as such. We have family traditions, which are basically things that are taken from all of the Caucasian groups. We do this at Christmas and this and this and this, but we have no roots as such as to what our black ancestors or relatives would have been doing in the States.
What about Oskaloosa, Iowa? Any relatives, any connections?
I personally know nothing. Whenever I go to a strange city, I always look in the phone book for Lafayette's.
Oh, my father does that too. I can't believe it. Another one.
Lafayette is a name that virtually there are none in Canada that we find. I've had uncles live in Quebec and Montreal in particular, and they would go through the phone books whenever they visited a city. There are no Lafayettes, white, black, any color under the sun, that we are aware of. And the family history, as I understand it, is that the family was definitely separated supposedly at the border, and we've lost a chunk of the family with my great-grandfather's brothers, and we do not know where they are.
Were they separated because immigration wanted to keep some of them back?
I honestly do not know. That would be something.
Maybe some of the older.
Yeah, some of the older ones would. Unfortunately, as I say, it is something that I'm very keenly interested in now, but we have never really talked about our past as such, and it is something that I really wish we had of, because great-grandmother Jamerson has died. My mother has died, and I think a lot of the information, if it is not preserved, will be gone, because my great-uncles and my grandfather are into their 70s, and, it may not be that long before they passed on.
There's a guy in Winnipeg, Bob Jamerson, who is Frida Ellis's
Mhm.
uncle, and he knows a lot
Mhm.
about. He's a person that is in his 80s now.
Mhm. Yeah, I've met him years ago. Many years ago.
Okay, you left Rosetown and you came to. Did you come to Saskatoon?
I went to college in Lethbridge.
Okay, you went directly to Lethbridge. Now, what was your reception in Lethbridge?
All of a sudden, black was in. There was a time when the theme from Shaft was out, and all sorts. Black movies were just
Superfly.
Superfly. Black movies were just